Have you ever opened a Word document or maybe just created one from scratch and realized that you maybe need to change the page size or the orientation or maybe the margins to make that page really stand out and look the way you want it to? Well, today we are going to take a look at how you can do some wonderful things with margins and page size and orientation. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and let's look at our Word document and change some of those kind of very basic settings. As we look at our little short example document today, we can see that it has a title and then it has, 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. And it is right now using just the default margins, and we might decide that we want to change that. For such a short piece of writing, it might be that we want to cut it out and put it in a journal. Maybe we want to actually copy this text and paste it, say, in a blog. We might decide to in some way embellish it and hand it to friends for a special occasion. But what we want to do right now is look at how we can make some changes to this document that will make it look better. So we'll go to Home in the ribbon, and then to the right of that, about 3 choices, is Layout. So we'll click Layout, and this very first section is Page Setup. And so we're going to look at it in some detail. Now we're going to start at the left with Margins, and we'll click the drop down. And right now, the normal margin setting is 1 inch for top and bottom, left and right. But we could change that, and I know sometimes if you just want to have everything fit, say, on one page, you may decide to go with narrow at 1/2 inch all the way around. So let's click that. And yes, it really brings the text up and to the left and out to the right farther. And it would help you fit text on a page if that's what you need to do. We could also then come down to moderate, which is sort of a compromise between normal and narrow. So we still have top and bottom margins of 1 inch, but the left and the right are 3/4 of an inch, kind of splitting the difference between the 1/2 and the 1. So let's look at moderate. So we have 1 inch at the top and then 3/4 of an inch on the left and right. And that might be what you need to do to get everything on one page as well. Let's see what else. Then we have wide, and I know kids are tempted to use this because, well, they don't really have enough words that they would like to use for, say, a report, and so if they just make the margins bigger, then that should make the report look better. So let's click on wide, where we have 2 inches now on the left and the right, and it occurs to me that I think I have seen this in, say, older books on their first page, for example. You might decide that this is an effect that you like for a journal or from special writing of some kind. Maybe you would even embellish this a little bit and make it a gift. So that setting does have its uses and purpose. Now, mirrored is kind of interesting in that mirrored assumes that you're going to print a whole lot more than just one page, but in fact you're going to print front and back on your pages so that you have essentially a book. Where, when we look at this, the top and the bottom are still 1 inch, but then the inside is 1 1/4 inches. So the inside is where the pages meet if you were to open that book, and it's where they would be bound. And then the outside is still 1 inch, so we'll click on that. Now let's go back to the margins button one more time, and let's come down to custom margins. This window is one that we will come back to look at in just a little bit, but for right now we can see that there's a margins tab within this page setup window, and it lets us manually, just 1/10 of an inch at a time, change the top, the bottom, the left, the right. So it could be that we would decide to change the top, for example, not as 1 inch, but we could say, oh, maybe 0.9, and we could get all of the information on one page that way. Let me come back down to custom margins because while that's fun, that's probably not what we would do the most. Although I have occasionally set them, depending on how my printer works, at say 0.78 or some really interesting kind of setting just to get things on the page and still keep it on one page. Down at the bottom though, you can see that it says right now we have mirror margins. We could change that, but even lower than that on this window, it says here is a preview. And we can apply that to the whole document, and actually the settings to the whole document, or we can apply the settings from wherever we've clicked, where our cursor is, this point forward. So we've applied it to the whole document, but know that we could say have a paragraph, click below that paragraph, and then apply it from that page on. So it really makes for some interesting contrasts and settings as you work in your documents. So for right now, we will just cancel. And we have looked at most of those margins. For the most part, when you are in a word processing document, you are going to want your page to also just simply be in what is called portrait orientation. Let me see if I can make this smaller so that you can see how that looks. So basically it's a rectangle, but it is very much a vertical kind of layout where the width of the page is narrower than the height of the page. But we can change that if we need to. And it just depends on what you are doing as to whether you need portrait or whether you need to come to orientation, the second button here, click its drop down and go to landscape instead. So now what you are typing on is wider than it is tall. I've reset the document back to just its default settings, but let's look at the different page sizes that we might want to use. So to do that, we'll again go to Page Setup, but this time to the third button and size. We'll click on the drop down, and when we do, we can see that it is simply kind of the regular old 8.5 by 11 page. But we have some other choices that might really be needed from time to time. Now, some of these choices will be limited by what your printer can do. So, for example, if I go to 8.5 by 14 and click on that, and let me again just kind of zoom out here a little bit. 8.5 by 14 is legal size paper, and that is great if your printer actually allows for legal size paper. Mine at home doesn't, so you would need to be a little bit careful about using that setting, but certainly this can give you a whole lot more space, about 3 more inches to the height of the page if that is what you need. Well, let's go back to size because there are some other things that we might want to look at. First of all, I have gone back to our just regular 8.5 by 11 size because we might decide that this could fit on, say, a half sheet of paper, and I might want to make a little brochure, a little booklet that is simply half the size of a regular sheet of paper. Well, I can do that. I can go to size and then come down to 5.5 by 8.5. And this makes it 2 pages, but you can see how that would work very nicely. And especially depending on what you wanted to do, I can see this as perhaps an invitation, perhaps the inset in a card, perhaps this could be a child's project of some kind, and this would help just kind of fancy up everything. Then if you change the margins a little bit, and again now we do have inside margins and outside margins, then we could play with those and see if that wouldn't help as well. I happen to have a journal that has European sizing to it. So let's go back to our regular 8.5 by 11 first, just so that we can see it a little bit better. And I'll scroll up to the top. And now let's see what happens when we go to some of those European sizes. Now, as I click on size and click down, the European sizes are A and B. So I have A3, A4, A5, and then as I scroll down, there's B4, 5, and 6. And depending on the kind of paper that you get, in a fancy paper shop, you might run into this as well. I believe that my little journal that I like to use and will occasionally print something on paper and then just paste it in is this size. And again, it's about a half of a sheet of paper, but not quite. And so I could make this adjust to my journal simply by using the A and B European sizes. Well, let's go back to our regular 8.5 by 11, because as I go to size and scroll down, I notice that there's some other interesting sizes that seem to be for envelopes. And then below that, I even have some sizes that look like picture sizes, don't they? 8 by 10, 10 by 14, 11 by 15. Those are just sort of regular sizes. And so we have a lot of options here for the very best possible choice. Now, what we need to do is look at one more, and that is to look at the tabloid size. For our last example, when it comes to page size, I thought you might be interested in seeing how 11 by 17 looks. Now, occasionally I've seen people use 11 by 17 for really large spreadsheets that go way out to the right, but in this case, I've set this up to look sort of like how you would create a newsletter by putting into columns, which we'll discuss in our next video. But you can see that it has the width of 8.5 twice, that's the 17, and then it's 11 inches tall. Let me see if I can pull it down just a little bit more so that you can see how that looks. So you would have the size of a regular letter page twice, but it's already connected, so you don't need to use binding if you're creating a newsletter. You simply fold the pages in half. This can be a great help if you are asked to create, say, a newsletter for a school. So again, 11 by 17, but you're almost always working with it in a landscape kind of view, because you're really thinking, well, I have 8.5 by 11, and then I'm going to put something else on the other 8.5 by 11, and then fold them in half so that I'm saving staples and time as I go through this process. I've returned to our default document and the way it looked originally, and one of the reasons why it looks the way it looks is that if I come to, again, this page setup group, and I look on the lower right where it says hyphenation, and I click that drop down arrow, it says that I am not allowing any hyphenation, which means if a word is long enough that it might go into the right margin, instead of hyphenating to go down to the next line, it just simply pulls the whole word down next to the next line, and we have word wrap. But if I say, well, I want to have automatic hyphenation, let me click on that to turn it on. And then as I look through, I have a couple of places where I now have hyphenation where I didn't have it before. For example, I have birthday presents that's hyphenated, and as I come down, non-starter, oh, and I almost missed grandson. So at least 3, if not 4, let's see, this is will become. So several places on the right margin where it has automatically split the word for me and now has hyphens instead. If you decide you don't want to have hyphens, easy enough. We go back to hyphenation and say none. Now you could say that you want to manually hyphenate, and that is fine as well. As we looked at margins at the very beginning of this lesson, we found that if we went to margins and went to the last choice, that it would take us to a window that had a lot of options available to us. Well, we can also get to that window by coming over here to the very lower right and finding this little arrow that points down and to the right. That's called a dialog box launcher. And when we click on that, we again get this page setup set of choices. And we've already seen the margins and even played with that a little bit, but we could also change the orientation here. So that's the second button in that page setup group. And we could go from portrait to landscape, for example. We've already seen that we can preview either the whole document or just from this point forward if we need to do that. But as I go back up to the top, to the right of the Margins tab, there is a Paper tab. And here we not only have a choice of what kind of paper size we want, which is exactly the same as what we were seeing before, but we also, if you have kind of a fancy printer that has, say, different trays, for example, this is where you can say, I want to pull this page from this tray. I can say that the first page may have, say, letterhead on it, whereas the other pages don't. And so you can just get really fancy and creative with how you set up the paper and how it might be printed out. To the right of the Paper tab, we have the Layout tab. And so here we look mostly at sections and headers and footers, which will be in different videos, but also the page, and I did want to show you this one. The vertical alignment says that that first title, the first line that you type will be at the top. But if you're creating, saying, a cover page, for example, you might say, well, I want it to be centered or justified or at the bottom. Let's try center, and let's see, we'll click OK, and now it moves it down. So I need to, let me do a file and a print preview because that might be the easiest way to see that. And so now we can see that we have moved that text to be centered on the page. Isn't that easy compared to figuring out how many lines of text you have and where it needs to go? But remember, this is from Page Setup, the dialog box launcher, and then when you go to Layout, you could choose Center, or we had it originally at top, but we also have some other choices that we might want to look at. And in this case, we'll simply come down to the bottom right and click OK. To learn even more, be sure to visit mymcpl.org/online learning. There you will find such great resources as Universal Class, LinkedIn Learning, and Learning Express Library. Be sure to join us each week as we premiere new videos every Wednesday and Friday at 1 o'clock. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360 or on YouTube at our MCPL MO channel, where you can find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.